Hey there. Tonight, we are following a trail of stone, scripture, and sky that may be older than every kingdom we remember. Recently, researchers fed thousands of ancient inscriptions, temple carvings, king lists, and damaged religious passages into advanced language models, trained to compare forgotten patterns across continents. And what came back was not one clean answer, but a chilling design. The same visitors, the same star-pointed origins, the same impossible years, and the same quiet suggestion that the gods of old may have been travelers who knew exactly how early humans would look at them. If this is your kind of late-night journey, take a second to like the video, subscribe, and settle in with me. Now let the lights grow softer. Let the room go dim around the edges. Let your jaw loosen, your shoulders lower, and your breathing move at its own calm pace. There is nowhere else you need to be right now. Only here, with the fire low, the air warm, and the long old question opening above us like a night sky. I have always found it strange that the oldest stories on Earth do not begin by asking what the gods looked like. They begin by asking where they came from. That difference matters. Appearance can be symbolic. Origin feels more stubborn, more physical, more dangerous. Perhaps. And all over the ancient world, people carved memories into stone and pressed them into clay and wrapped them inside sacred language. Memories of visitors who did not simply descend from heaven in a poetic sense, but pointed upward, toward the stars, as if the place they called home was not purely spiritual at all. That is where the modern AI work begins. Not with belief, not even with certainty. With pattern recognition, researchers took mythic records from Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, Mesoamerica, and the Hebrew scriptures, then used machine learning systems to compare phrases, Martians, descriptions of descent, accounts of flight, strange lights, terrifying noise, and long reigns that do not fit any ordinary human chronology. The systems were also trained on geography, atmospheric science, and celestial visibility, so that when an old text mentioned a direction, or a star, or a season, it could be checked against what the sky may actually have looked like in antiquity. What emerged was not proof in the simple sense. We should be honest about that. It was something softer and, for me at least, much more unsettling. The same shape of story appearing again and again in places separated by oceans, deserts, mountains, and thousands of years. Advanced beings arrive. They are different, but not so different that humans cannot stand near them. They teach. They command. They travel through the air. They are linked to specific stars. Then they leave. And after they leave, memory keeps breaking around the same hard edges. The documentary source behind this script leans heavily into that ancient astronaut interpretation. And tonight, we are staying faithful to that spine. The claim is not modest. It suggests that the gods of old were real visitors from another world, likely one similar enough to Earth for them to move here, breathe here, survive here, and interact with us without dissolving into immediate biological disaster. When modern astronomers discover new planetary systems almost daily, That idea sounds less impossible than it might have decades ago. If intelligent life exists elsewhere, and if some branch of that life learned how to cross the impossible distances between stars, then what would it do on arriving at a younger world? Honestly, that question feels almost more revealing than the answers people rush to give, because if we ask what humans would do, we already have a very uncomfortable reference point. We explore, we study, we classify, we interfere, we justify, we tell ourselves stories about guidance while arranging control. We might monitor a developing civilization if we thought it was nearing a threshold. We might establish hidden bases. We might shape certain groups while remaining distant from others. We might even place our own people among them, if we could, or encourage loyalty structures that would outlast our visible presence. That dark possibility appears early in the source, and I think it should be allowed to breathe. The visitors may not have arrived only as benevolent teachers carrying gifts and wisdom in perfect calm. They may have been curious, strategic, even managerial. Ancient humans, looking upward at beings with vehicles, weapons, strange garments, or impossible knowledge, would have had no stable category for such a presence. God would have been the closest word. It might not have been the truest. Imagine the first sighting in some forgotten age, not as a loud cinematic event, but as a deep unease in a settlement at dusk. The firelight low, the smell of smoke and animal hide. A child looking upward first, then others turning. Something moving in the sky, but not like a bird, not like cloud, not like any weather they know. It descends without flapping. It glows, but not like flame. It makes a sound so unfamiliar that later generations would compare it only to thunder, waterfalls, or many chariots together, because language collapses when a people see what they have no framework to name. This is why the star origin matters so much. Again and again the old stories say the beings pointed upward. The source mentions Sirius as one popular candidate in modern speculation, though it never fully settles there. And the AI angle lets us dwell in that uncertainty. When the latest astronomical comparison tools were used to map recurring stellar references in ancient traditions, Sirius did appear often, but not alone. Other candidate systems and Earth-like worlds remain possible. What mattered more in the pattern was not one single address. It was the consistency of upward origin and the repeated sense that these beings came from somewhere physically real. If they did, the source argues, then their world could not have been completely alien in every biological condition. It had to share enough with Earth to make long-term contact possible. Similar atmosphere, perhaps. Similar gravity, perhaps. Similar chemistry. That is speculative, yes, but not absurd within the framework being built. Even our own science searches the sky for habitable zones, planets with familiar temperatures, water potential, survivable surfaces. A far older civilization might have done the same. We are simply imagining the search from the other end. Once that possibility is opened, the myths begin to feel less ornamental and more like damaged reports. Sumer gives us the Anunnaki. Egypt gives us sky gods and divine kingship tied to descending powers. India gives us gods in Vimanas, machine-like aerial vehicles crossing continents. The source even points to twin beings, described in Hindu traditions, who traveled between India and Central America and may explain echoes in sacred architecture. That claim is bold and certainly debated, but within the documentary it forms part of a larger map of contact. And what a strange map it is. Step pyramids rising in separate lands. Stories of beings crossing oceans without ships. Flying machines making terrible noise. Fuels described in fragments. Quicksilver. Mica. Sweet compounds no translator fully understands. Here again, the AI angle becomes useful. Modern translation models can compare damaged Sanskrit references with technical lexicons, botanical databases, mineral terms, and ritual metaphors all at once. Sometimes the result clarifies. Sometimes it only deepens the mystery. A word that once seemed symbolic begins to look chemical. A phrase that once seemed ceremonial begins to sound mechanical. That does not mean every machine in myth was a machine in the engineering sense. But it does mean some old descriptions refuse to stay politely metaphorical once they are examined with enough cross-reference. The source also moves into one of my favorite unsettling zones: impossible chronology. Ancient dates that should not exist if the figures involved were only human rulers, living ordinary terrestrial lives. The AI systems were used here not to prove a fantasy, but to cluster recurring anomalies. It found the same thing scholars have found with their own eyes for a very long time, only faster and with much broader comparison. Certain texts insist on reigns or intervals that stretch into tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even over 1,000,000 years when later copies and linked records are considered. Palenque, Sumer, India. Again and again the numbers refuse to behave. Of course, conventional historians usually classify such figures as symbolic, corrupted, theological, or dynastic abstractions. That remains the safer explanation, and we should keep it on the table. But the source takes a different path. It suggests that the dates may reflect one of the strangest side effects of advanced travel: time moving differently for the travelers than for the people waiting on Earth. Not a final answer, only a possibility, yet a possibility that lets the same being appear across centuries while aging very little from its own frame of experience. Late at night, in a dim room, that thought lands differently. Imagine a visitor arriving in one century, leaving, traveling at extraordinary speed, returning, and discovering that many generations have passed. To the people below, the same God has come again. To the traveler, only a few years may have gone by. A machine age explanation for mythic immortality. Cold, elegant, and a little sad. By now our fire is lower, and the room has hopefully grown quieter around you. Keep breathing slowly. Let the old stones and older stars do the heavy lifting. We are only at the threshold. We have not even reached the flying machines in full, or the bizarre relics left behind, or the sacred objects that may have behaved like hidden reactors in a temple age. But already the pattern is taking shape. Visitors from above. Earth-like origin. Guidance mixed with control. Myths converging across continents. Impossible dates that refuse to lie down quietly. Before we go farther, let the image widen once more. Imagine temple walls in different languages and different ages, all holding what seem like separate memories. A Sumerian list of rulers, too old to be plausible. An Indian verse about airborne beings crossing seas. An Egyptian sacred scene where sky and kingship touch. And somewhere in Mesoamerica, a stone plate that seems to know more about descent than a myth should know. The AI did not prove that these belonged to one civilization. What it did was more disturbing. It showed how often the same emotional structure appears. Arrival, superiority, teaching, flight, departure, then longing. And longing may be one of the deepest clues of all. Human beings do not usually invent absence with such consistency, unless some part of memory is trying to hold on. So many traditions do not merely say, "the gods came." They say, "the gods left, and may one day return." That ache sits quietly behind the grand stories. It is there in the way old temples face the sky. It is there in sacred calendars built around descent, ascent, and reappearance. It is there in the way later priests guarded fragments of knowledge as if preserving instructions for a future meeting. That mood is where our journey really begins tonight. Not with certainty, but with recurrence. Not with one story, but with many stories bending toward the same impossible horizon. In the next movement, we will drift deeper into the accounts of skycraft, Vimanas, and ancient records that sound less like fairy tales the longer AI compares them line by line. And the old world will begin to look not more magical, but more technical, which in some ways is a much darker thing. Once the ancient stories begin speaking about vehicles, the whole mood changes. A god who descends in glory can remain symbolic for a very long time. A god who arrives in something that roars, glows, lifts, hovers, and crosses distances without horses or sails becomes much harder to file away as pure poetry. This is where the AI comparisons became especially provocative. Researchers were not simply scanning for divine names. They were comparing technical patterns in description. Sound, motion, fuel, altitude, range, repetition of specific actions, across Sanskrit epics, biblical passages, Mesoamerican imagery, and later commentaries. The systems began flagging passages that behaved less like devotional metaphor and more like damaged attempts to describe technology. The source leans heavily into the Indian material here, so let us follow it carefully. In several ancient traditions from the subcontinent, flying machines called Vimanas appear not as one single object in one single story, but as a repeating class of craft associated with divine or semi-divine beings. Some accounts speak of aerial travel between distant regions. Some describe machines that move with terrible noise. Some imply vertical ascent, rapid transit, or long journeys no animal could survive. When modern translation software was trained on multiple surviving manuscript traditions and then paired with subject experts in Sanskrit, ancient ritual language, and early Indian cosmology, certain terms, once softened into vague miracle, began looking more concrete. Not fully understood, not safely translated in every case, but concrete enough to trouble the easy categories. One of the strangest areas involved fuel. The documentary mentions that some old texts preserve fragments about what powered the Vimanas, and that only part of the vocabulary can be translated with confidence. Quicksilver appears. mica appears. Other ingredients sound sweet, or honey-like, or materially unfamiliar. This is exactly the sort of place where modern AI becomes useful and also frustrating. It can cluster every known ancient usage of those terms, compare them to medical texts, metallurgical recipes, ritual compounds, agricultural references, and alchemical traditions, then rank probable meanings. But if the original referent belonged to a lost technology, or if the language around it was already partially symbolic when first written down, then even a brilliant system cannot recover certainty from a broken chain. Still, the fact that ancient texts even attempt this sort of material description is worth sitting with. Gods in many traditions do not need fuel. Machines do. Imagine an old scribe at work by lamplight, copying a passage he half understands. He knows the craft flies. He knows it roars. He knows the mixture includes quicksilver. That word he can preserve. Another ingredient glitters or flakes. Perhaps mica. Perhaps something related to it. And so he writes the nearest term he has. A third ingredient tastes of sweetness or is compared to honey because no better earthly analogy presents itself. He does the best a human mind can do when standing beside a thing outside its age. The source also stretches the Vimana material outward geographically, making a bold claim that twin divine figures traveled between India and Central America and left behind echoes in step pyramid architecture. That claim is certainly controversial and would not satisfy most mainstream historians. We should acknowledge that gently. Yet within the documentary, it serves a larger purpose. It suggests not isolated cultural wonder, but a network of influence crossing oceans before conventional history allows for it. When AI was used to compare broad mythic structures rather than only isolated words, that theme of travel kept returning. Beings who move not village to village, but continent to continent. Machines not tied to roads or rivers, towers, steps, platforms, elevated sacred places that may have been built not only to worship above the ordinary world, but to mirror or welcome dissent from it. Again, not proof. Pattern. But pattern can be unnerving when it appears too often. This is where I think the story becomes darker in a very sleep story sort of way. If these accounts preserve even a dim memory of advanced travelers, then ancient humanity was not merely dazzled by the sky. It may have been reorganized by it. Certain cities favored. Certain priesthoods instructed. Certain rulers legitimized by access to beings who could move through the air like no human could. Worship then becomes entangled with dependency. Architecture becomes a memory of encounter. Myth becomes administration after the event. And then the impossible dates return, heavier than before. The source brings us to Palenque, to the Sumerian king lists, and back to India, where reign lengths and chronologies push so far beyond human expectation that they feel almost mocking. Here the AI models were used in a different way. Not to confirm the dates, but to map where such anomalies cluster and how they relate to stories of descent, divine rulership, flood reset, and renewed return from the sky. What emerged was a pattern of chronology tied not to local pride alone, but to contact periods. Before the flood, before the break, before the withdrawal. Then, after the catastrophe, the gods descend again. The Sumerian king list is especially haunting in this context. Names arranged in sequence, reigns measured in spans no ordinary dynasty could survive. And then the flood arrives, like a blade cutting one age away from another. Afterward, rulership returns in shorter, though still astonishing, durations. Conventional scholarship usually sees these numbers as royal ideology, sacred exaggeration, or textual layering over time. That remains a responsible reading. But the documentary asks whether some of the lengths could reflect the perspective of the visitors themselves, not the people under them. Late at night, that idea has a cold beauty to it. Imagine a traveler leaving an orbiting vessel, walking among humans, ruling or instructing for what to local people becomes generation after generation. Then imagine that traveler returns to the ship or travels onward at tremendous speed, and from that frame experiences only a small fraction of the elapsed time. The same being returns later. The same face. The same authority. On Earth, many lives have passed. In the record, it looks like one God with impossible longevity. In physics, if the assumptions are generous enough, it becomes at least a speculative possibility. This is not the final answer. The documentary itself treats it as one possible explanation. But it is a powerful one, because it turns mythic immortality into temporal dislocation rather than divine abstraction. It makes the old gods feel not more magical, but more remote in a technical sense. Older than us. Yes, but perhaps not eternal. Simply traveling in ways that made our clocks irrelevant. The source then suggests that the visitors eventually left. This matters. Ancient contact stories are often less about permanent rule than about visitation, instruction, disruption, and withdrawal. The gods arrive. They teach some groups, help some groups, perhaps exploit some groups. They study. They use local resources. And then they depart. They do not intend to die here. They take their instruments with them. Their mother ships vanish. Damaged craft may remain for a while, but most operational technology goes back into the sky. That leaving creates one of the saddest feelings in all these traditions. Because when technology disappears and only memory remains, religion rushes in to hold the shape of what has been lost. A machine becomes a divine bird. A vehicle becomes a radiant throne. A pilot becomes a god. A dangerous object becomes a sacred relic. A timetable becomes prophecy. Human societies begin preserving fragments of behavior they no longer understand. Festivals, processions, temple alignments, sacred prohibitions, all attached to a source that has withdrawn beyond explanation. The documentary gives an example through Shiva and Garuda. Garuda is not treated as a symbolic bird alone, but as a vehicle capable of carrying Shiva to places beyond ordinary Earth. That is an extraordinary reframing. A creature once read as mythic transportation becomes aerospace technology in sacred language. Again, whether one accepts the interpretation is one matter. The emotional effect is another. Suddenly, religion becomes a museum of misunderstood machinery. And then we arrive at one of the most famous images in all ancient astronaut lore, the tomb lid of Palenque. I know this image has been discussed endlessly, mocked, admired, argued over. copied into paperbacks, and held up in lectures for decades. Still, when you slow down and look at it through the narrative the documentary is building, it retains its power. The carved figure appears seated in a posture that many viewers instantly compare to a pilot or operator. Bent forward, hands extended, head positioned towards some sort of apparatus. Something like flame or energy behind. Something like controls before. The source insists that standing before it in person creates a shock no textbook summary captures. And that shock is partly visual, but partly chronological. The image is ancient. The technological association is modern. The human mind feels both at once and hesitates. Now add the AI layer. Pattern recognition systems were trained on body postures from known driving, piloting, and cycling positions, on ancient seated iconography, on symbolic tree of life motifs, on ritual throne poses, and on the engineering drawings of enclosed craft. What those systems return would not end the debate, but they could show something very uncomfortable. That the human figure on the palenque lid clusters visually with operation posture more often than with repose. Not conclusive. Not enough for a courtroom. More than enough for a sleepless mind. Picture the tomb chamber itself. Stone air. Dampness. A low lantern or torch. The carved slab above the dead. Shadows moving across the figure as your own breathing echoes faintly back from the walls. It is easy to see why someone standing there would feel that the old world was looking back with technical memory hidden inside sacred art. By now, the room around you may have grown quiet enough for these old images to feel almost close. Flying craft in Sanskrit verse. Impossible reigns in king lists. A pilot posture in Mayan stone. Gods who arrive, teach, and leave again. AI cross-referencing all of it, not to tell us what to believe, but to strip away the comfort of thinking each anomaly belongs to one harmless, isolated tradition. There is one more mood worth holding before we leave this stage of the story. The feeling of standing in an age after the visitors have gone but before memory has fully cooled. The elders still remember what their grandparents said. The priests still keep dangerous fragments in sacred language. Children grow up hearing that the gods once crossed the sky in machines that roared like the end of weather. No one can build such things now. No one can repair them. But everyone behaves as if the sky may still be watching. That, more than anything, is the emotional landscape these myths preserve. And perhaps that is why the old records are so repetitive about descent and return. A civilization does not easily forget the source of its deepest interruption. Even if details rot away, the structure remains. They came from above. They moved unlike us. They ruled too long. They knew things we did not. Then they were gone, leaving us to turn astonishment into religion and broken memory into story. In the next part, we will move deeper into scripture and relic, into Ezekiel, Enoch, and the Ark, where the old records no longer sound merely poetic, but dangerous, as though the past left behind not only stories, but machines that could still kill the people who came too near them. By the time we reach the old scriptures, the story grows quieter and more dangerous. Myths can still be dismissed with a patient smile. Poetry can be tucked safely into symbolism, but when a witness begins speaking in the first person, when a man says, "I saw this, I heard this, I fell on my face because of this," then the atmosphere changes. The AI teams working on these sacred texts understood that immediately. They were not only translating words, they were comparing sequences of perception: shock, noise, descent, light, mechanism. The systems were trained to detect when ancient narration behaves less like ritual praise and more like eyewitness reporting under extreme, unfamiliar conditions. That is why Ezekiel matters so much in this kind of investigation. In the old biblical account, Ezekiel does not begin with theology. He begins with weather that does not feel like weather. A windstorm from the north, an immense cloud, fire, brilliant light. Then living beings, wings, motion. Sounds so powerful he compares it to rushing waters, to war chariots, to the voice of overwhelming force. Traditional faith reads this as a vision, and that interpretation has shaped centuries of devotion. The documentary source we are following turns the scene another way. It suggests Ezekiel was watching a craft descend and was doing his absolute best to describe it using the language available to an Iron Age priest. Modern AI comparison tools intensify that possibility in a rather eerie way. When systems were trained on thousands of accounts of aerial descent, rotor wash, mechanical vibration, wheel geometry, metallic description, and witness stress language, the Ezekiel narrative clustered not with calm visionary poetry, but with high-impact observation. Again, not proof. Pattern. But pattern can press on the nerves like a thumb. Imagine the scene slowly. A group of captives or laborers in an open place. Heat in the air. Fine dust on skin. The ordinary misery of work or waiting or exile. Then a sound above them that does not belong to wind alone. At first, distant, then growing. People shading their eyes, heads lifting. Ezekiel looking north and seeing not a clean divine form, but a phenomenon. Brilliant light in cloud. A descending object. Sand or dust blown upward by the force of it. Noise rolling over the ground so strongly that later words can only compare it to the largest and most frightening sounds known to the human body. This is one of the details that the documentary emphasizes, and rightly. Before Ezekiel theologizes, he reacts. Fear first. Sensory overload first. Then description. He sees wings, or things like wings. He sees beings, or supports, or presences associated with the structure. He sees wheels. The wheels disturb him, especially because they move in ways normal wheels do not. Forward, backward, right and left, without the expected turning motion. That detail may seem small, but it is exactly the sort of technical oddity that an eyewitness remembers when confronted with machinery beyond ordinary understanding. AI models trained on vehicular motion descriptions flagged this element strongly, not because Ezekiel knew what he was seeing, but because confusion around impossible maneuverability often produces unusually concrete language. I've always found that detail the most persuasive in emotional terms. People invent plenty of marvels, But they do not often invent the right kind of awkward confusion. Ezekiel sounds like someone trying to remain faithful to his own perception, while trapped inside a vocabulary too small for it. Metal also appears in the account, or something like glowing metal. This matters because many sacred visions favor fire, cloud, and light, but do not spend much time trying to say what a surface looked like. Ezekiel does. The thing shines. It emits. It moves. It stops. The wings hang down when still. The noise changes with motion. This is not a vague revelation, drifting free of materiality. It behaves. And because it behaves, the documentary links it to another disturbing category of ancient record, the account that sounds less like revelation and more like contact report. This is where the Book of Enoch enters the story. I should say gently that Enoch is already a strange and powerful text even without any extraterrestrial interpretation. It is full of dissent, watchers, forbidden teaching, corruption, giants, punishment, and cosmic judgment. But in the documentary framework, and especially under the AI discovery angle you ask me to use, the text becomes something even more unusual. Researchers used modern language models to compare multiple surviving manuscript traditions of Enoch line by line, not only in translation but at the level of repeated narrative architecture. The result, according to this storytelling frame, was not one secret phrase, but one repeated signal. Descent from above. Division among the sky beings. Rules broken. Contact with human women. Transmission of dangerous knowledge. Punishment from a higher command authority. That sequence sounds theological in one register and almost military in another. The source treats the Watchers not as purely spiritual fallen angels, but as advanced beings under discipline who violated orders. Some wanted contact with humans. Some wanted sex with humans. Some wanted to teach what had been forbidden. The rebellion becomes not a symbolic heavenly drama alone, but a mutiny, a breach of protocol among a superior visiting force. In that reading, the Lord above them is not merely abstract deity, but a commander figure, the source of order, whose regulations were broken by subordinates descending to earth. Late at night, by firelight, that interpretation feels unnervingly coherent. Imagine a vessel far from home, a crew living in confinement for immense stretches of time, a habitable world below, green, fertile, full of intelligent local life. Some members of the crew begin to resent the rules. They want fuller contact. They want to interfere, to indulge, to experiment, to possess. They descend. Their names are remembered imperfectly. Their acts become legend. Their children become monsters in memory because the boundary crossed felt too large for simple human categories. This is the kind of narrative that advanced AI models are surprisingly good at isolating. Not belief, but structural tension. They compare rebellion stories across myths and identify the recurring logic: restricted knowledge, unauthorized descent, hybrid offspring, catastrophic consequences. When Enoch was set beside other ancient narratives in this way, it did not look smaller. It looked more central. The documentary also leans into the physicality of the result. The beings do not merely visit. They alter. They teach metallurgy, enchantments, hidden knowledge, arts that human society was perhaps not ready to manage. That too has a technological feel when read through the ancient astronaut lens. Forbidden knowledge does not have to mean magic in the theatrical sense. It can mean techniques, methods, weapons, energies, processes that destabilize a younger civilization. I think that may be one reason this material has held people so tightly for so long. It combines seduction and warning. Advanced visitors arrive. Some are curious. Some are compassionate, perhaps. Some are reckless. Humans receive gifts, but the gifts carry ruin. We rise by means we do not understand, and the price arrives later. That emotional pattern is very old, very human. It is also exactly what the AI systems kept finding in comparative analysis. Not random weirdness. Repeated moral geometry. The Watchers descend. They take human wives. They produce beings remembered as giants or unnatural offspring. They teach. They transgress. Judgment follows. In the documentary voice, this becomes a report of extraterrestrials behaving badly among primitives who mistook them for divine beings. In religious language, it becomes sin against heaven. The two readings are not identical, but they disturb the same part of the mind. Stand for a moment in the space between them. A desert sky at evening. Men and women looking upward. A craft or descending brilliance in the far distance. Weeks later, new knowledge in the settlement. Metalwork. Strange calculations. Altered loyalties. Pregnancies surrounded by whispers. Authority structures fraying. Then fear. Then plague, or violence, or flood. A civilization trying to explain disaster by saying the visitors broke the order of heaven. Which perhaps they did, in whichever vocabulary one prefers. By now, the room around you should feel deeper, a little more hushed. Keep your breathing slow. We are moving toward the most dangerous object in the whole documentary next, and it helps to arrive there calmly. Because once scripture starts sounding technical, relics start sounding less sacred in the harmless sense. They become devices, containers of energy, hazards passed from priesthood to priesthood under layers of reverence and fear. That is exactly what happens with the Ark of the Covenant. The Source treats the Ark not as symbol first, but as machine first. To a deadly object, something that kills when touched, poisons when approached, and requires exact handling protocols, special garments, and separation from ordinary people. Before we enter that room fully, let us stay one moment longer with Ezekiel and Enoch, because together they create the bridge. One gives us a witness trying to describe a descending craft. The other gives us a narrative of sky beings who break command and alter humanity. Machine above. Crew below. Rebellion inside the mission. That is the architecture the documentary wants us to see. And once you see that architecture, the old scriptures begin to feel less like isolated sacred visions and more like fragments of one long damaged history, remembered under pressure, copied by believers, preserved by frightened institutions, and now re-examined by modern AI with enough comparative power to notice what earlier generations could only sense in pieces. There is another reason these texts matter so much under AI analysis. They preserve confusion in a very human proportion. Ezekiel repeats himself, doubles back, struggles for comparisons, and seems trapped inside vocabulary too small for what he is seeing. Enoch moves between awe, law-breaking, teaching, offspring, and judgment with a strange logistical weight. When researchers compare those structures with invented visionary writing, the difference is sharp. These accounts feel less polished and more pressured, as if memory reached the page before theology finished smoothing it. That may explain why later traditions guarded them so intensely while also softening them. The stories were too important to lose, but perhaps too dangerous to preserve in naked form. So they became angelic, visionary, symbolic, edifying. Yet under that gentler surface, the technical skeleton remains. Descent, crew, restricted command, forbidden knowledge, human contact, punishment from above. If that reading carries even a fragment of truth, then Scripture becomes something tragic as well as sacred. A long effort by frightened human beings to translate superior technology into moral language before the original context disappeared. And that is why the movement toward the ark feels so natural. First, the craft, then the crew, then the object left behind. The old world grows more technical with every step, and the more technical it grows, the more sorrowful it begins to feel. Because technology without understanding tends to become ritual, and ritual around a lethal object is one of the saddest inheritances a civilization can receive. If the old stories preserve even one object that feels more like technology than symbol, it is the Ark of the Covenant. The documentary speaks about it with absolute intensity, almost with dread, not as a beautiful chest of religious significance alone, but as a device. Dangerous, active, deadly to approach in the wrong way. Modern AI could not excavate the Ark itself, of course, but researchers used language analysis to compare every major scriptural passage describing its effects, then measured those descriptions against known symptom clusters from electrical trauma, radiation exposure, contamination events, and restricted handling protocols in modern hazardous environments. What came back was deeply unsettling. The texts behave less like ornamented devotion than like inherited safety memory. That phrase is worth lingering on. Inherited safety memory. Because the people in the biblical world may not have known how the object worked, but they certainly knew it had to be treated carefully. Some could carry it. Most could not. It required exact materials, exact coverings, exact distance. It could not be touched casually. It could not be opened without consequence. Its vicinity was not simply sacred. It was dangerous. Imagine the Ark not on a museum label, but on a wagon road under a punishing sky. Priests walking beside it with measured steps. Animals snorting nervously. Dust rising around wheels. No one speaking louder than needed. The object itself covered, restrained, framed by poles, so human flesh need not brush what lies within. Fear here is not theatrical. It is procedural. That may be the darkest kind. Everyone present knows something can go wrong. No one fully understands why. Then it does go wrong. The source returns to the famous story of Uzzah, reaching out when the ark appears about to fall. His intention is practical: prevent the sacred object from toppling. Yet the instant he touches it, he dies. Traditional faith reads this as divine holiness too fierce for irreverent contact. The documentary asks a different question. What if the object discharged, or emitted, or exposed him to something the ancient writers could only interpret as God striking him down? One event alone might remain symbolic, but the surrounding pattern grows more disturbing. The documentary notes that people near the ark were said to sicken and die. Skin altered, nails and body parts damaged, blindness, collapse, fear spreading through communities who no longer wanted the object near them. When AI comparison tools aligned those descriptions with modern toxic exposure data, the closest resonances were not spiritual ecstasy or plague in the broad, vague sense. They clustered around radiation like deterioration, contamination, and lethal proximity to an active source. We should be careful. Ancient symptom description is rarely precise by modern medical standards. Yet the emotional shape fits too well to dismiss lightly within the documentary's own logic. The ark is not merely revered, it is feared like a portable danger. I've always found the clothing detail especially eerie. Only certain priests may approach. They must wear specific, layered garments. They serve as a separated priesthood with restricted access. In ordinary religion, that can mean holiness, yes. But in the technological reading, it can also mean protection. Primitive, imperfect, partly understood protection passed down as ritual because the original engineering rationale has been lost. The form survives. The explanation changes. People obey because disobedience kills. Picture a chamber where the ark rests. Stone floor cool beneath sandals. Oil lamps trembling in the still air. A curtain or veil dividing common sacred space from lethal sacred space. Priests whispering instead of speaking normally, because fear changes volume before it changes belief. One man checks the drape over the object. Another adjusts his garments. A younger attendant watches too closely and is warned back with a hand signal sharp enough to sting. Not because elders enjoy secrecy, but because they know the old stories and would prefer not to add another. The documentary then takes a still darker turn. It proposes that the ark was, in effect, a plutonium device, or something functionally similar. A long-duration power source far beyond ordinary ancient manufacture that is obviously speculative and far outside mainstream biblical scholarship. Yet inside this storytelling frame, it becomes the central technical explanation. Not a magical chest, not a symbolic throne, a dangerous energy source the Israelites preserved without fully understanding, and which later priests ritualized because ritual was the only surviving way to manage it. That is why the story of its movements matters so much. Once the ark returns among the Israelites, deaths continue. The source emphasizes the number 72 and the tragedy of children dying simply from proximity. There is a deep sorrow in that image, and we should keep it soft, not sensational. Mourning celebration, dancing, relief that the holy object is back among the people. Then, quiet sickness, collapse, people realizing too late that joy is no defense against exposure. The object is sacred, yes, but not safe. From there, the documentary follows the Ark into Solomon's era, and the atmosphere grows more secretive still. The temple in Jerusalem gives the Ark a dedicated room, a holy place set apart. But the documentary adds another layer through traditions outside the canonical Bible, especially the Kebra. Here Solomon is linked to flying machines, and his connection to the Queen of Sheba becomes part political romance, part technological intrigue. Their son later journeys to Jerusalem and, according to the source, becomes entangled in one of the most consequential thefts in sacred history. This whole section should be told slowly because it has the texture of a night operation. The son arrives. He sees the Ark. He understands its importance, perhaps not fully, but enough. Solomon, according to the narrative, cannot openly surrender it. Priests would rebel. Institutions would crack. Yet the son and his allies create an exact copy. Already that detail is interesting. Copies belong more naturally to technology and statecraft than to mystical uniqueness. At night, the priestly guardians are made drunk. The original is removed. The copy is left in its place. By morning, no one knows. For a little while, the temple continues as if nothing has changed. Imagine that night. Courtyard shadows. A sky without moon, perhaps, or with only a thin sliver. Men moving with deliberate care. Wooden surfaces touched lightly to avoid noise. Metal fittings wrapped in cloth. Drunken breath from sleeping priests drifting inside chambers. The copied Ark already waiting. Hands shaking, but not from reverence alone. Outside the walls, animals stamped and readied for departure. The whole city asleep while its most dangerous relic is exchanged. Then flight. The sun travels south toward Ethiopia, and the documentary adds that Solomon cannot catch him because the stolen Ark is moved with flying technology. That takes us to one of the source's great obsessions, that the most sacred objects of antiquity were often entangled with vehicles, skycraft, and technical capacities now dismissed as myth. The result is a story where the Ark is not only stolen, but transported with speed and means ordinary ground pursuit cannot match. When it reaches Ethiopia, the old horror repeats. Crowds gather. Devotion surges. People draw near. People die. The same sickness appears. The same fear rises. The Queen of Sheba realizes that whatever this object is, it cannot remain openly among the people. So it is hidden, lowered into the earth, buried beneath sanctified ground. In the documentary's telling, that place becomes the site beneath the church at Aksum, where the Ark is said to remain even now. This is where the tone becomes almost mournful, because the source treats the Ark as perhaps the best possible surviving proof of non-human advanced technology in the ancient world, yet also as something almost impossible to examine. Religion protects it. Faith surrounds it. Institutions forbid direct scrutiny. If even a fragment survived intact and could be studied freely, the argument would end. But the time is not right. The spirit of the age, in von Daniken's language, is not ready. I think that sadness matters. The object is imagined as final evidence, and yet evidence wrapped in holiness becomes unreachable. The chest lies somewhere in darkness, beneath centuries of worship. perhaps active, perhaps dead, perhaps gone entirely, while above it, generations sing hymns that may preserve a memory of radiation as reverence. Stay with that image for a moment. A church above ancient ground, candles burning, priests chanting, pilgrims kneeling. Beneath them, a chamber no ordinary visitor enters. Beneath that, perhaps a box lined with old gold and old fear. Not from this planet, says one religious authority in the documentary. A statement so strange that it almost slips past the ear before the mind catches it. The AI element here makes the whole thing feel sharper. Not because machines can solve faith, but because they can compare patterns humans avoid comparing too directly. Priesthood restriction maps cleanly onto hazardous access control. Garment rules onto contamination memory. Symptoms onto radiation clusters. Copy substitution onto strategic theft. Long-term concealment onto institutional quarantine disguised as sanctity. Again, none of this proves the Ark was a reactor, but it does something perhaps more powerful for a sleep story. It makes the old object feel technically plausible in a terrifying way. And once one sacred relic begins to feel like hidden machinery, the rest of the ancient world changes around it. Temple rooms become storage spaces for dangerous inheritance. Priests become technicians who no longer know the original science. Worship becomes behavioral preservation around unstable power. The line between religion and containment grows thin enough to frighten anyone standing too close. There is one more detail the AI comparisons brought forward, and it may be the saddest of all. Dangerous technologies leave behind social behavior. People form exclusion zones. They appoint specialists. They encode access rules. They warn children back from the perimeter. They make the custodian sacred so obedience feels noble instead of merely cautious. The Ark narratives display exactly that pattern. Whether by divine command or inherited fear, a whole culture learned to build distance around one object. And distance changes the imagination. A child raised near such a tradition would hear that the Ark belongs to God, that only chosen priests may approach, that certain rooms must remain sealed, that certain garments matter, that joy itself does not protect the careless. By adulthood, the behavior would feel holy. This is how technical precaution can become sanctity over generations. The copy story sharpens that unease. If a duplicate could be made good enough to fool priests for days, then the original's importance was not in appearance alone, but in effect. Same form, different function. Ancient language carrying a strangely modern terror. Gold on the surface, death in the wrong touch. That may be the true mood of the Ark material in this documentary. Terror wrapped in reverence, not because the people were foolish, but because they were trying to live beside one piece of advanced power they could neither reproduce nor safely abandon. The highest word they had for that excess was holy. In the next part, we leave the chamber and step back into open landscapes. Sea floor finds, Mars shadows, and Nazca, where the traces of contact seem less concentrated and more scattered, as though after the visitors departed, they left behind not one secret, but a whole wounded geometry across the world. By the time we leave the sealed fear around the Ark, the story spreads outward again, from one dangerous object into a whole landscape of smaller shocks. This is where the documentary begins, gathering its scattered artifacts and anomalies into one larger suggestion. If advanced visitors really came here in the deep past, then they would not have left only scripture and relics behind. They would have left traces in machines, measurements, cut stone, impossible designs, and places where the ground itself still seems to remember interference. The source pauses first over ancient mechanisms. I like that choice, because it slows the fever of the argument for a moment and lets us sit with something physical and undeniable. A bronze gear device pulled from the sea, an ancient earthquake detector, fragments of technical intelligence appearing in ages that official history prefers to imagine as simpler. None of these objects prove extraterrestrial contact by themselves, and we should say that softly and clearly. Human beings are inventive enough to surprise us over and over again, but in the documentary frame, they matter because they prepare the mind for a broader possibility. If the ancient world was already more mechanically gifted than our lazy stereotypes allow, then perhaps some of the stranger records deserve a second look. That is where the AI systems become especially useful again. They are very good at noticing clusters. Not one mechanism alone, not one image alone, but a repeated pairing of technological skill, impossible description, and ritual memory. Researchers fed diagrams, excavation reports, old translations, material studies, and site maps into the models, allowing them to compare patterns across cultures that no single specialist could comfortably hold in mind at once. The result was not a single glowing answer. It was accumulation. Too many technical edges appearing beside too many sacred claims. Then the documentary lifts its eyes toward Mars. This part has a different mood, colder, quieter, almost lonelier. Modern probes send back images from another world. Red dust, fractured stone, distant ridges, long silence. On some of those surfaces, the source claims, there appear anomalies with elements of intelligent design. Faces, structures, arranged forms. Most planetary scientists would urge caution here, and they are right to do so, because barren landscapes are masters of suggestive illusion. Yet the documentary uses these Martian images for a larger emotional reason. It wants to remind us that we have now become the sky watchers our ancestors once were. We send machines out. We photograph surfaces. We stare at strange formations and argue over whether nature alone is enough to explain them. That shift is important. We are no longer only the species asking whether visitors once came. We are the species beginning to do the kind of distant search those visitors might once have done. Still, the documentary does not linger on Mars for too long. It returns to Earth, and to one of the great open wounds of ancient mystery, Nazca. Even before any AI model touches the data, Nazca already feels unreal in the right way for this story. The desert there does not behave like a generous place. It is harsh, dry, exposed, almost lunar in its severity. The ground is covered with dark stones and pale underlayers. Heat settles over it like invisible pressure. Distances tremble in the light, and yet across that difficult stillness run lines so large, so abrupt, and in some cases so oddly placed, that every generation feels compelled to explain them again and again. The documentary is openly impatient with mainstream explanations. astronomical calendar, cult roads, water worship, processional pathways, agricultural markers, hot air balloon sites. It treats each as too small, too hesitant, too detached from what the lines actually feel like on the ground and from the air. That does not mean every conventional theory is worthless. Some likely explain part of the picture, especially the simpler figures. But the documentary insists that Nazca is not one thing. It is two things layered together: human imitation and something technical that came first. That distinction becomes the heart of the entire section. Imagine the desert from above. A long line starts abruptly, runs for miles, then stops with the same unnerving confidence. A mountaintop appears cut flat rather than weathered naturally. Zigzag forms lie beneath certain pathways. Great broad strips cross difficult terrain, as though the earth had once been treated less as landscape and more as surface. Then, elsewhere, you see the familiar animal figures: spider, bird, monkey, shapes made by scraping away the darker crust to reveal the brighter ground below. Those, the documentary says, could easily have been made by local people with simple means. There is no mystery in the scratching itself. The mystery is in the larger formations, especially the cut mountains, the severe linearity, and the buried strangeness hinted at by modern measurements. This is where the AI researchers in our retelling step in beside geologists and electrical engineers. Ground conductivity maps, magnetic surveys, topographic scans, excavation records, satellite imagery, and drone photography were fed into analytical models designed to detect inconsistencies. The desert surface behaved one way. The lines behaved another. Electrical resistance on some lines was said to be vastly higher than in the surrounding sand. Magnetic fields shifted unnaturally in key areas. The systems did not conclude what lay beneath, because the data remains incomplete and protected by law and heritage restrictions. But they did confirm that the anomalies cluster around precisely the features the documentary treats as oldest and least likely to be mere ritual imitation. I have always found that combination very potent for storytelling, not because it solves the puzzle, but because it sharpens the silence around it. Something beneath the lines, something under the cut mountain, something the local people may have seen without understanding, then copied in devotion after the original purpose was gone. Picture one such first sighting: a high, dry plain under blinding sun. Local people standing at a distance from some descending object. Not a runway in the modern aviation sense, perhaps, but a machine or probe dropping from above, blasting away sand, flattening stone, making a terrible noise and leaving behind one long visible scar. It lands, or hovers, or takes measurements. Perhaps it seeks minerals, gold, uranium, something hidden in the mountain. The people below have no language for geological scanning or automated resource detection. They only know that the gods from above came down here, on this exact place, and that the earth itself changed where they touched it. Then the visitors leave, but the scar remains. This is where religion would begin, quietly at first. A witness tells a scribe. A child grows up hearing that the gods preferred this plane. Someone scratches a line in imitation. then another. Then a ritual forms. If the sky beings used lines, perhaps lines call them back. If they descended on the flat cut place, perhaps offerings should gather there. A whole cult can emerge from one misunderstood technological event, especially in a landscape where the marks do not wash away easily. That is the documentary's theory, and within its own architecture, it is strangely persuasive. The large, severe, apparently technical features belong to the visitors. The smaller figures and later expansions belong to local humans, imitating what they once saw. The desert then becomes a layered memory. Technology first. Devotion second. The more I sit with that idea, the sadder Nazca feels, because it transforms the lines from art alone into longing. People making signs too large to be read from the ground because they believe the true audience was above. That does not require extraterrestrials to be emotionally powerful. But within this source, it becomes almost heartbreaking. The gods landed once. The people never forgot. Generation after generation kept drawing into the earth, hoping to be seen again. The cut mountains deepen that feeling. The documentary insists some peaks were not naturally shaped but deliberately sliced away. If true, and this remains debated, then the missing debris becomes part of the unease. Where did it go? Why cut here and not there? Why align broad lines with strange buried zigzags? AI image, comparison with known quarries, natural erosion patterns, and modern grading operations would not tell us purpose, but it could help separate weather from intent. In the documentary's telling, with comes, and then there is the possibility of measurement. Not landing strips exactly, though popular imagination loves that phrase. More like staging surfaces, or scan fields, or sites where a descending probe interacted with electromagnetic conditions below the surface. The zigzags, in the documentary voice, may have shaped or supported a field effect. Again, this is speculative, but it adds a technical logic to features otherwise treated as absurd. The mountain is cut because something inside matters. The line sits above it because the machine needs it. The local people later preserve the shape without preserving the science. Once that mood is established, Nazca begins to infect the rest of the ancient world in the viewer's mind. If one sacred site preserves both advanced intervention and native imitation, how many others might do the same? How many myths begin with one encounter and then echo through ritual long after the original event has vanished? The documentary closes this movement by broadening again into the modern world. Ancient signs in the ground, modern craft in the sky, government documents, declassified videos, military observation, former officials speaking too calmly about something that should be impossible. The same pattern of soft disclosure returns. Not a single great revelation. Small steps, one witness at a time, one released report, one unsettling interview. The visitors, if they exist, and the institutions that know of them, if they know, both seem to prefer gradual adjustment over shock. That idea hangs over this whole part of the story like a second sky. There are those who claim authorities already know more than they say. That radar rooms have tracked objects moving too fast and maneuvering too sharply to belong to any human state. That mountain facilities have watched patterns around the planet for decades. that scientists hold back because they fear ridicule or social instability. The documentary treats this almost tenderly, not as a conspiracy full of snarling villains, but as a nervous human instinct. If the truth is large enough to shatter the stories a civilization tells itself, then perhaps that civilization will approach it sideways. You can feel that same sideways approach in von Daniken's own tone. He does not want a religion built around his name. He wants the spirit of the age changed. He wants old information seen from another angle. The AI discovery framing fits that desire remarkably well. Modern tools do not create the mysteries. They rearrange them. They force old anomalies to stand beside each other in the same room, where they begin looking less lonely and more like fragments of a single event no one has fully dared to describe. And perhaps that is what makes Nazca such a powerful threshold in the story. It is not only a place, it is a method. One line made by technology, 100 made by memory, one descent from above, centuries of devotion scratched into the earth afterward. If that pattern is true there, then it may be true everywhere. The old world becomes full of imitations of contact, and our task, human and increasingly assisted by machine, is to tell the first scar from the later prayer. In the next part, we move even closer to the modern edge, into military observers, declassified testimony, soft disclosure, and the great withheld message of Fatima, where the sky may have offered not judgment, but a warning that human belief itself was not ready to hear. By the time the documentary reaches the modern world, the tone becomes almost intimate. We are no longer only standing in deserts and temple ruins, reading old carvings through AI-assisted comparison. We are suddenly in radar rooms, inside mountain facilities, in television interviews, and listening to retired officials speak in voices so calm that the content becomes more unsettling. The source wants us to feel continuity, not rupture. The same visitors who may once have been called gods are, in this reading, still near enough to be tracked, reported, hidden, and released in careful fragments. That is why the idea of soft disclosure becomes central. The documentary insists that if extraterrestrials are real, and if some governments or scientists already know more than the public does, then neither side would want a crude, sudden revelation. Too destabilizing, too likely to break religion, politics, and ordinary human confidence all at once. Instead, the truth, if truth it is, would seep. A little here, a little there. Crop circles, declassified footage, senior voices saying just enough to make denial more exhausting than belief, but not enough to end the uncertainty. There is something deeply modern and deeply ancient about that at once. Ancient priests also disclosed slowly. The holy was layered. The dangerous was veiled. The inner chamber did not open to everyone at once. Knowledge came through stages, through readiness, through ritual and hierarchy. The documentary's modern secrecy feels like a technical version of the same old human instinct. Some truths are rationed because the keepers fear what rapid exposure would do. Imagine a mountain installation in winter. Concrete corridors, fluorescent light, computer screens glowing in cool colors, air-conditioned silence. A few officers speaking in clipped ordinary phrases while data scrolls in front of them. Outside, Snow, perhaps, or only dark stone and a hidden entrance. Inside, an object appears on a screen, moving at a rate no pilot expects. It stops too quickly, turns too sharply, moves again, not like any craft built under familiar physics. The official who sees it is not transformed into a prophet. He writes a report. He says as little as his role requires. Yet the old pattern repeats. Strange thing in the sky. Human observer. Vocabulary too small. Official caution afterward. The documentary includes figures like Paul Hellyer and other public voices who state openly that they believe extraterrestrial presence is real. One can disagree with them and still feel the quiet significance of the moment. High-ranking officials are not village visionaries. They speak from inside structures of command. When they say that UFOs are as real as aircraft, or that strange objects have been tracked for decades, the effect is very different from folklore. It feels bureaucratic, which, for this story, is almost the perfect modern echo of ancient temple records. Then there is the detail about speed. Von Daniken recalls seeing tracking systems that observed everything around Earth, and hearing that some unknown objects moved too fast and maneuvered in ways ordinary human systems could not imitate. Rectangular turns, violent accelerations, sudden directional shifts. This is familiar territory now in public conversation. But inside the documentary, it serves a larger emotional purpose. It links the impossible wheel of Ezekiel, the roaring Vimana, the descending probe at Nazca, and the modern tracked object into one continuous line of technological superiority. And yet, the source keeps returning to character. The visitors, if real, are not imagined as brute destroyers. They are advanced, wise, soft in the sense of patient. They do not announce themselves by annihilation. They understand shock. They understand that primitive societies, and perhaps we are still primitive by comparison, do not absorb cosmic humiliation gracefully. So they proceed gently. That is the claim. It is a very generous interpretation, perhaps more generous than history teaches us to expect from the powerful. But it is central to the documentary's mood. This becomes especially important when we arrive at Fatima. I have always found this part one of the eeriest because it touches a story still alive inside modern religious memory. In 1917, in a small Portuguese village, large crowds witnessed what later devotion would frame as the miracle of the sun. Light in the sky, movement, radiance, a public wonder. The church named it in one way. The documentary names it in another. Not miracle, but craft. Not Marian display, but extraterrestrial event interpreted through the only sacred language available to the witnesses. The AI angle lets us deepen that feeling. Researchers compared witness descriptions from Fatima with patterns from mass sighting reports, atmospheric events, devotional narratives, and controlled disinformation responses. What stood out was not certainty, but incompatibility. The event behaved too oddly for ordinary solar phenomenon, too publicly for a private vision, and too theologically disruptive for the institutional response that followed. Then the withheld message enters, and the story darkens beautifully. Lucia, one of the central child witnesses, receives a message. The message is passed upward toward the Pope. Decades later, when the time comes to reveal it, the Pope refuses, saying it would create panic. That line is one of those small historical details that can keep a person awake longer than they intended. Panic over what? If the message were ordinary devotional warning, why not release it? If it concerned war alone, why the strange hesitation and later contradictions? The documentary seizes on exactly that tension. Then comes the bishop's remark that the message concerned belief, not world war. That changes the air immediately. Because now, the withheld content is no longer only political. It touches faith itself. The documentary speculates, and it is important to say speculates, that the message may have been something like this. Greetings, humans. Do not fear. You are not alone. We were here before. We will come again when you are ready. Under this interpretation, the Church recognized at once that the event did not belong to the Virgin Mary at all, but to the same category of visitors ancient peoples once called gods. No wonder the message was sealed. No wonder belief itself trembled. Picture the Vatican chamber where such a text is read. Heavy drapery, polished wood, the smell of paper, wax, old rooms, restrained anxiety, journalists waiting outside for a statement, a pope reading lines that do not fit the structure of Christian revelation as he has been taught to guard it. Perhaps silence follows. Perhaps hands fold. Perhaps the room feels briefly cold despite its richness. Then the decision. Not yet. Do not publish. The world would panic, whether one accepts that interpretation or not. It is a magnificent psychological hinge in the story. Ancient gods, modern miracle, hidden message, institutional fear. The whole documentary has been moving toward that exact knot. And then comes the 100-year mood. The source suggests that if the visitors appeared in 1917 and expected humanity not to be ready, then perhaps they allowed a century for technical, social, and psychological development before trying again. That idea is speculative to the point of dream, but dream is part of what gives it power. It lets Fatima become not only a misunderstood event in the past, but a delayed invitation hanging over the future. A countdown built into belief. This is where soft disclosure becomes emotionally complete. Ancient contact in myth, scattered relics, modern sightings, official caution, a withheld sacred message. Then the suggestion that the return may not be random at all, only timed. Keep your breathing steady here, because this is the sort of material that can start to feel more immediate than it probably should at night. The documentary's larger point is not simply that UFOs exist. It is that humanity has been in a long, slow conversation with an outside intelligence and has repeatedly misread it through the available categories of each age. In antiquity, we said gods. In scripture, we said angels. In modernity, we say unidentified craft. The object changes less than our language for it. AI, in this frame, becomes the late arriving translator, not a prophet, not a believer. More like an immense patient archive assistant able to hold thousands of myths, reports, interviews, place names, astronomical references, and symptom descriptions at once. Then whisper back that the same shape of event keeps appearing under different names. Descent from above, fear, interference, hidden instruction, departure, promise of return. I think that is what gives the modern material its eerie force. It does not erase religion. It hollows it slightly from within and fills the cavity with technological memory. It does not destroy miracles. It reclassifies them. It does not laugh at ancient witnesses. It takes them more literally than their own descendants have dared. And that can be frightening, because if humanity was once guided, monitored, or manipulated by advanced visitors, then our most treasured sacred narratives may be records of contact rather than revelation in the pure theological sense. If the modern world already knows this in fragments, then every slow release of data is not just about defense policy. It is about preparing civilization to survive the loss of an old story about itself. That is the true panic the Pope may have feared in the documentary's interpretation. Not war, not invasion, reclassification. The moment a species realizes that part of what it called heaven may have been another civilization, by now the documentary is preparing to close, and the mood turns reflective. It gives us Erich von Däniken not only as theorist, but as witness to his own long intellectual break with strict religion. A young Catholic student reading a Bible that no longer matches the idea of God he expected. A hotel worker writing articles between shifts. A traveler standing before pyramids, tombs, stelae, and desert lines. A man who decided that the old stories must be taken as serious records rather than fiction. In a way, that autobiographical ending belongs here. This whole journey has depended on angle of vision. Not new stones, new reading. AI is simply the newest tool in that same effort. It does not invent the mysteries. It strips away some of our habits of looking. And after all the tracking stations, interviews, withheld messages, and ancient signs in the earth, the final emotional question remains very small and very human. If they came before, if they shaped us, if they left, will they return? The documentary says yes, or at least hopes yes. Slowly, softly, in a way humanity can survive. There is one final softness in the documentary's closing logic that I do not want to lose. It keeps insisting that revelation, if it comes, will probably not arrive as conquest. It will arrive as adjustment. A little more data, a little more courage from institutions, a little more willingness from ordinary people to let old categories bend without shattering. That is a comforting thought on some nights and a chilling one on others, because it suggests the return, if return there is, may already have begun in the smallest possible way, not with a fleet over cities, but with the slow rearrangement of what counts as normal in the human mind. That is where we will go next, into the final part, where the ancient astronaut thesis, von Däniken's personal path, and the possibility of return all come together under one long gaze upward, not as certainty, but as a strange patient hope that the old visitors never fully stopped circling our world. By the time we reach Fatima, the story has become almost unbearably delicate. Ancient temples and broken king lists belong safely to distance. Even Ezekiel, Enoch, Nazca, and the Ark can still be tucked into a deep historical shelf if a person wishes to do that. But Fatima is different. It sits too near the modern world, too near photography, newspapers, public memory, church hierarchy, and named children whose lives unfolded under direct scrutiny. That is why the documentary uses it so strongly. It is not only another strange event, it is a modern wound in the boundary between miracle and contact. The setting matters first. Portugal, Itenjoba Ishichi. A rural place. A field. Rain. Mud. Pilgrims gathering in increasing numbers because children have said that something from beyond the ordinary world has been speaking to them. That alone would already be enough to unsettle any institution with a memory. Crowds do not gather around children unless hunger is present first, and Europe at that time was a continent full of fear, war weariness, and spiritual strain. Then comes the day of the great sign. The sky changes. Light behaves strangely. The sun, or what the witnesses take to be the sun, seems to move, flare, tremble, descend, or dance, depending on whose testimony one reads. The church would eventually call it a miracle. The documentary suggests something else entirely. Researchers working with modern AI systems compared written testimonies from Fatima with older miracle reports. Atmospheric events, astronomical impossibilities, mass sighting narratives, and close encounter descriptions from the 20th century onward. The goal was not to erase devotion, but to test the descriptive structure itself. Did the witnesses sound like they were reporting a symbolic Marian vision? Or did they sound like people watching an object or phenomenon behaving in ways no natural celestial body should behave? The answer, within this narrative frame, was deeply unsettling. The pattern did not sit cleanly inside normal religious language. That is where the withheld message becomes the heart of the darkness. Lucia, the child most closely associated with the long secret, claimed to receive a communication meant for the highest authority in the church. The message moved upward, carefully, solemnly, into layers of power that knew very well what words can do when attached to heaven. Then the waiting began. Years passed. Decades. The appointed date approached. Journalists expected disclosure. Believers expected sacred confirmation. And then, in the documentary telling, a terrible hesitation entered the room. The Pope read the text and refused to reveal it, saying it would create panic among humanity. Panic is a very revealing word. People do not panic because a saint asks for prayer. They do not panic because heaven reminds them to repent. Panic belongs to messages that reclassify reality. That is why the documentary leans so hard on this moment. It suggests that if the message had truly belonged within ordinary Marian devotion, there would have been sorrow perhaps, urgency perhaps, but not panic. Panic implies rupture. Panic implies that the event did not confirm the expected structure of belief. It threatened it. Then comes the bishop's statement that the message concerned belief itself rather than world war. This detail feels almost too sharp, as if history accidentally left the key in the lock. If it did not concern a coming military catastrophe, then what kind of revelation about belief would be severe enough to frighten the church into silence? The documentary's answer is bold and entirely in character with everything that came before. The message was not from the Virgin Mary in the old theological sense. It was from the visitors. The same intelligence that ancient people once interpreted as gods. The same pattern of sky contact filtered now through 20th century Catholic expectation. In this reading, the apparition wore familiar sacred language because that was the only form the witnesses and the watching church could initially endure. But the content beneath the appearance was much larger and much stranger. Imagine the message in its softest reconstructed form. Do not be afraid. You are not alone. We were here before. We will return when humanity is ready. The documentary never proves those exact words. Of course, it speculates. Yet once that speculation enters the mind, the entire century begins to feel different. Picture the Vatican reading room again. A sealed document opened. Thin paper between old fingers. Light from a high window crossing the desk. Assistants waiting nearby, trained not to react too quickly. The Pope reading, slowing, perhaps reading again. Outside, the machinery of the church continues. Bells, footsteps, ceremony, certainty. Inside, the letter or text before him suggests that the source of the Fatima event may not fit the devotional universe the institution has promised to guard. In that instant, the problem is not only theology, it is civilization. What happens if the most beloved Heavenly Mother in modern Catholic imagination has, in one key event, been confused with an intelligence from elsewhere? That is the sort of realization that does not stay politely inside doctrine. It spills. I think that is why Fatima feels more dangerous in this documentary than Nazca or Palenque. Those older sites are already wrapped in archaeological distance. Fatima sits inside living worship. Cathedrals rose around it. Millions prayed there. Stained glass fixed its sky event into permanent sacred color. If the event is reclassified, then modern belief has not simply inherited an old misunderstanding. It has continued one. The source uses that possibility to make a larger point about the rhythm of disclosure. The visitors, if they are real, do not force direct recognition when a culture is too rigid to withstand it. They appear in forms that can be processed. In 1917, according to the documentary's logic, humanity lacked the technological and cultural framework to hear a direct extraterrestrial announcement without collapse or ridicule or mass confusion. So the event arrived, wrapped in the nearest available sacred form. The crowd saw a miracle. The institution contained it as miracle. The deeper message, if such a message existed, was withheld because the world was not ready. That leads to the 100-year idea, one of the most dreamlike and eerie threads in the whole source. A century from 1917. Enough time, perhaps, for global communication, satellites, television, space travel, modern astronomy, and the gradual normalization of aerial anomaly reports. Enough time for humanity to become at least a little less provincially certain about its place in the universe. The documentary openly hopes that the visitors may have marked out that interval in advance, that the sign at Fatima was not a closing miracle, but an opening notice. We are here. You will not understand this now. Later you might. Late at night, that kind of timeline can feel almost tender, also unnerving. It treats history itself as a classroom paced by an outside intelligence that knows how quickly or slowly we absorb shock. This is also where the documentary's tone softens toward modern institutions, even while accusing them of silence. Governments, religious authorities, and scientists may not all be malicious in withholding what they know. They may simply be afraid of social rupture. There is a peculiar mercy in slow disclosure. A species that built its moral imagination around one set of cosmic assumptions may need time before being told that its gods, angels, miracles, and sky beings were not purely spiritual in origin. A hard revelation could humiliate civilization. A soft one might educate it. The AI angle you asked for actually makes this feel more contemporary and more believable as a narrative mood. Advanced systems are not emotional, but they are very good at showing humans when the same pattern keeps repeating in different clothes. A miracle of the sun in one century. A structured aerial event in another. A sacred apparition in one region. A controlled unknown craft report in another. The machine does not panic. It only says these descriptions belong closer together than you are comfortable admitting. That may be what frightens institutions most. Not one extraordinary event. Pattern. By now, the old documentary is ready to turn inward again, toward the man whose life became bound up with these patterns. The movement feels natural. After so many temple walls, desert lines, biblical machines, lethal relics, military hints, and sealed Vatican messages, we return to one human figure who spent decades trying to insist that mythology and archaeology should be read from another angle. Not as fiction, not as harmless superstition, as damaged memory of contact. Before we leave Fatima completely, stay with the field one last moment. The wet earth under thousands of shoes, faces lifted, hats dark with rain, the light changing in a way the body knows is wrong before the mind has words. A child watching something older than her vocabulary. Adults praying because prayer is the most stable container available when the sky behaves like intent. Then, silence afterward. Then the long work of interpretation. Miracle, says one age. Craft, says another. Message withheld, says both. And perhaps that is the final emotional power of Fatima inside this story. It reminds us that modernity did not end sacred misreading. It only made the consequences of misreading more complex. The old visitors, if visitors they were, did not stop using the heavens when cameras were invented. They only found themselves entering a world where every sign would be fought over by religion, media, state power, skepticism, and longing all at once. There is another reason Fatima stays under the skin. The people in that field were not trained witnesses or careful researchers. They were ordinary believers with tired feet and wet clothes, standing in mud because children had said the sky might speak. That matters. If the event really was some form of contact, then those people did not fail by calling it holy. They simply named it with the strongest language their world had given them. Human beings always do that. We meet the unknown through the vocabulary we already trust. The AI comparison work only sharpened that sadness. When the systems lined up, miracle reports, mass sightings, and later modern encounter narratives, one pattern kept returning. Witnesses borrow their symbols from whatever sacred structure already lives inside them. A Roman sees an omen. A medieval peasant sees a saint. A Catholic child in 1917 sees Mary. The event may differ less than the interpretation. That possibility gives Fatima its particular sting. The crowd may have seen something real and still misunderstood it completely. Then comes the long silence afterward, perhaps the most painful part. A sign appears. A message is sealed. Decades pass. The field becomes a shrine. The shrine becomes a world center of devotion. And all the while, the withheld words remain hidden in a room somewhere, waiting for a century that might hear them differently. That is an almost perfect image for this whole documentary. Humanity living beside a truth it cannot yet classify, turning uncertainty into pilgrimage, while time does the slow work of preparation. In the final part, we will draw back from the field, back from the sealed message, and sit beside Erich von Däniken himself, the young believer turned investigator, the hotel manager turned world traveler, the man who decided that the gods of the past were not fantasies, but misunderstood astronauts. And we will end where the documentary wants to end, not in proof, but in expectation, with the possibility that the return of the gods may simply be the return of the visitors, and that the world has been preparing for that recognition more slowly than it knows. By the time the documentary reaches its end, the ancient gods have become something very different from what they were at the beginning. They are no longer only figures on temple walls, or names in epics, or carved beings descending in sacred texts. They have become a hypothesis about human history itself, a suggestion that our species may have mistaken advanced visitors for divinity, then built religions, kingships, and civilizational memory around encounters it could not technically interpret. And standing at the center of that suggestion, still speaking with the same stubborn energy after decades, is Erich von Däniken. I think the film is wise to end with him not as celebrity first, but as a young believer, disappointed by God. That beginning matters because it gives the whole journey a human shape. He was raised within strict Catholic education. He expected a perfect deity, one who made no mistakes, one who did not need vehicles, one who did not revise plans, test humans clumsily, or behave in ways that seemed too material. Then he read the Bible closely. Ezekiel disturbed him. Enoch disturbed him. The God he found in Scripture did not match the God he had been taught to expect. That wound, small at first, became a lifelong opening. Picture the young student late at night. A desk. A religious schoolroom gone quiet. Latin text on the page. Greek nearby. The smell of paper, dust, lamp heat, old wood. Outside, perhaps snow, or only Swiss dark. Inside, a teenager reading that God travels, that angels descend and desire human women, that heaven behaves less like pure perfection and more like command structure. Vehicle, trial, and error. It is the kind of private intellectual discomfort that can redirect a whole life. No thunder. No vision. Only the slow moment when belief ceases to fit neatly and curiosity becomes more honest than obedience. From there, the path becomes unexpectedly ordinary. Hotels, reception desks, bar work, service, seasonal employment, travel in the gaps between jobs. This is one of the things I find most touching in his story. The great ancient astronaut thesis does not emerge first from a university chair or an official institution. It grows out of a man using his free time, his wages, his restlessness, and his skill with words to chase places that bothered him. He reads before traveling. He arrives already carrying the mainstream explanations. Then he stands before the actual stones and feels that the official answers do not fit the emotional weight of what he sees. That is a very human beginning for a forbidden theory. Imagine him young in Egypt, not yet famous, not yet polarizing, simply alert. Camels smell in dry heat. Pyramid faces rising with that peculiar authority only very old geometry possesses. Dust in the light. The body tired from travel and yet suddenly sharpened by arrival. In Saqqara, in subterranean chambers, in front of walls and shafts and impossible stone, the old doubt returns. Not the childish doubt of wanting to rebel, but the mature doubt of wanting explanations proportionate to the evidence. That pattern continues as he moves through the world's archive of anomalies. He writes articles first, small essays, questions about the Bible, questions about ancient myths. Then the book, rejected by many publishers, sent back again and again. Too strange, too unprofessional, too far from what society wished to read seriously. And still it survives, partly because one editor, one contact, one conversation opens the door. That detail feels almost mythic itself. Great heresies and great mistakes alike often enter the public world through a narrow practical accident. Then comes publication, then translation, then fame, then all the strange economics of success. Millions of copies moving, rights divided, influence spreading wider than profit. But the documentary is not really interested in contracts. It is interested in conviction. Von Daniken insists he was not the first person to think in these terms, but he was among the first to say it plainly as fact rather than fiction. The gods were astronauts. The myths were memories. The scriptures were misunderstood reports. The sacred was technical before it was theological. Whether one agrees with him or not, that directness is part of what gave the idea power. And perhaps that is why the documentary closes not with a final solved artifact, but with a final posture, looking upward and waiting. The source makes clear that, in its view, the return of the gods is really the return of the visitors. Not supernatural beings descending to judge in traditional religious form, but advanced intelligences re-entering a world they once influenced. Everything in the documentary prepares that expectation. Ancient records, shared myths, dangerous relics, modern sightings, government caution, Fatima's withheld message, soft disclosure. All of it bends toward one long horizon of return. There is something both comforting and tragic in that. Comforting because the source imagines these beings as wise, patient, not needlessly cruel. perhaps even protective in the long scale of history. Tragic, because if they return openly, humanity may lose certain cherished illusions forever. We may have to admit that our sacred stories were built from contact, misunderstood as transcendence. We may have to see ourselves not as the center of creation, but as one young civilization among many, primitive in the eyes of older travelers. We may have to realize that some of our religions preserved fragments of truth by accident, while missing the nature of that truth almost completely. That kind of recognition would feel like grief before it felt like wisdom. The documentary knows this, I think. That is why it keeps insisting on gradual change. We are not to be shattered all at once. We are to be nudged. A little declassified footage. A little more academic courage. A little more willingness from ordinary people to let old categories bend without shattering. AI becomes part of that soft preparation. Not a god, not a prophet, just a new set of eyes, large enough to hold the old fragments together and say gently that the same impossible story keeps happening. Recently, researchers fed mythic chronologies, witness accounts, geological scans, scriptural descriptions, and ancient engineering anomalies into systems designed to detect deep narrative recurrence. Those systems did not announce salvation. They did not declare final proof. They returned something quieter and somehow more powerful: conversions. The same shape of contact appearing again and again, too often to remain comfortable, too scattered to dismiss without effort, too suggestive to settle fully into orthodox history. That is where the documentary leaves us. Not at certainty. At pressure. The pressure of too many anomalies leaning in one direction. The pressure of old religion cracking slightly under reclassification. The pressure of modern institutions speaking in half measures. The pressure of one long human habit of naming as divine whatever arrives with superior power from above. I have always found that pressure more interesting than confidence. Confidence ends inquiry. Pressure keeps a person awake a little longer, listening. Let the room around you settle now. The fire lower. The shadows slower. The old temples have receded. Nazca is far away again. The ark is sealed in the dark. Fatima is quiet under stone and glass. Mountain observatories keep their screens. Somewhere in memory, a young student is still reading Ezekiel under a lamp and feeling his world tilt. Somewhere an old researcher is still stepping onto a stage and telling audiences that the spirit of the age must change. And above all of them is the same sky. That may be the deepest reason these stories endure. The stars have always made human certainty look temporary. Every civilization tries to arrange meaning beneath them. Every religion raises architecture toward them. Every empire eventually fades under them. If there are visitors out there, or if there were, then all of our sacred history may be one long attempt to speak about encounters that exceeded the categories available at the time. If there are not, then these myths still reveal something extraordinary about the human mind. Its need to place intelligence above, to trace order downward from the heavens, to believe that meaning once arrived from beyond the horizon. Either way, the night sky keeps its authority. The documentary wants you to expect a return. Perhaps not tomorrow. Perhaps not in the crude thunder of science fiction, but in the slow accumulation of signs, more open testimony, better images, more archaeological anomalies impossible to ignore, more AI models comparing the old world until its hidden symmetries become impossible to unsee. The gods, in that final mood, return not only as beings, but as reinterpretation. The old records come back to life before the old visitors do. That may be the softest version of contact we are ever going to get. First, the meaning returns. Then the fear. Then the adjustment. Then perhaps, if the documentary's dream is right, the visitors themselves. There is one thing I appreciate in von Daniken's closing tone. He does not want a cult around himself. He does not want blind belief. He wants a shift in perspective. That is a more generous desire than many critics grant him. He wants people to look at the old information from another angle, to let the possibility of contact complicate religion, history, and human pride without turning the complication into another prison. In that sense, his role in the documentary is not priestly. It is unsettling, yes, but also strangely pastoral. He sits with the disturbance rather than solving it. And maybe that is the best way to end a night like this. Not with a trumpet, nor with a landing, nor with a final argument sharp enough to close every question, but with a quiet upward glance, a sense that the past may be stranger than the stories we inherited about it, and that the future may be preparing to answer very old messages in a language we are only now learning to hear. So let your breathing slow again. Let the stars go a little farther away. Let the old visitors remain old visitors for one more night. Let the sealed messages stay sealed. Let the cut mountains, impossible wheels, and dangerous golden chests fade into the soft dark where all unresolved things can rest for a while. If they came, they left. If they left, memory stayed. If memory stayed, then perhaps return is never only about ships in the sky. Perhaps it is also about recognition. The long-delayed moment when humanity finally understands what it has been remembering. The fire is low now. The room is still. The gods have gone back to the stars, or to the hidden chambers of the mind. Or perhaps those are not as different as we once thought. There is something almost merciful in the fact that the film does not force a final answer. It leaves us in the old human place between evidence and interpretation. If the visitors were real, then myth preserved them imperfectly. If they were not, then myth still reveals how deeply we expect meaning to come from above. In either case, the stars keep their pressure on us. We look up. We wonder. We rearrange our stories. That may be why the ending can feel calm rather than only alarming. A return, if it ever comes, would not simply reveal the visitors. It would reveal humanity to itself, our hunger for gods, our fear of being small, our habit of wrapping strange truth in sacred language so it can survive. The old myths were not foolish in that sense. They were carrying memory as far as they could. So let the stars remain distant tonight. Let the books close. Let the radar rooms dim. Let the desert lines lie quiet under the moon. If the gods return, perhaps they will not ask for worship. Perhaps they will only ask whether we have finally learned how to look. Good night.